Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Kent City Council Committee of the Whole meeting. Today is Tuesday, April 28th, 2020. Just a reminder, this is a remote meeting due to the COVID coronavirus emergency stay-at-home order. So thank you to everyone that's joining us. Kim, could you let us know if we have everyone today?
Thank you, Council President Troutner. I have everybody except for Les Thomas. I believe he'll be late today.
All right, it looks like Councilmember Thomas is joining us, and then I believe we have everyone. Is that correct? All right, thank you so much. Looking at the agenda, we just have a couple things. We're just going to change a couple of the participants that will be presenting, and then we are going to swap item H with item I, and otherwise everything will stay the same. So if nobody has any objections, we'll go ahead and move on to the presentations. So looking at the agenda, the first item up is the 2020 legislative session recap, and Briahna Murray will be joining us.
Okay, I have shared my screen. Can others see it?
We can see it. Great, thank you.
Wonderful. I'm going to begin the slideshow here. Okay. So while I'm in this slideshow mode, I cannot see a hand raise function or anything along those lines. So I'll encourage everyone to primarily ask questions at the end of the presentation and to just take a note of it between now and then. But if there is something that comes up, please feel free to just interrupt me and I'll try and answer it on the spot as well. I'm pleased this evening to provide you with a presentation on the 2020 legislative session that wrapped up just over a month ago. As I think you all know, I'm Briahna Murray with Gordon Thomas Honeywell Government Affairs, and I am your lobbyist down in Olympia and serve as your advocate on a daily basis during the session, as well as a lot of work during the interim. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to give you an overview of this past legislative session. I'm going to have a particular emphasis on the outcome of your state legislative priorities and your top priorities in particular, and then outline some next steps that I anticipate occurring here over the next 6 months. So without further ado, I will just dive right into an overview of the 2020 legislative session. I will share that with this overview, I assume that nobody knows anything about the legislative process as I go through and describe it. So some of this will be a repeat for many of you. The legislative process is a 2-year cycle. The 2020 legislative session was the second year of that 2-year cycle. The first year of the cycle is referred to as the long session, and the second year is referred to as a short session. So this past session was a short session and was scheduled to last 60 days, and the legislature did adjourn during that allotted time. Democrats currently hold the majority in both the House of Representatives and the state Senate. They held the majority in 2019, and that remained the case in 2020. During a short session, the legislature focuses on adopting supplemental budgets. They're supplemental operating, capital, and transportation budgets. What that means is that they're going in mid-fiscal year, so halfway through their two-year fiscal biennium, and making amendments to the budget that was adopted the previous year. In addition to making those amendments to the budgets and adopting supplemental proposals, all legislation that was introduced in 2019 automatically carries over and continues to be considered in 2020. Additionally, the 2020 legislature can introduce new bills. When you add up the bills that carried over from 2019, as well as the new bills introduced in 2020, there were a total of 3,773 bills considered this past session, which is a large number and more than we typically see. Of those 386 bills passed the legislature. Once the legislature concluded its work and approved bills as well as supplemental budgets, the governor then goes through a process of signing the bills into law as well as signing the budgets into law. Most of the legislature's work completed prior to the ramp up of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the 2 weeks following the conclusion of the legislative session, it really reached its height. That's when we saw the stay-at-home order be issued. And the governor was in the role of trying to respond to the impacts of the pandemic in a manner that the legislature really didn't have an opportunity to. As a result, the governor vetoed several different budget sections as well as bills in response to that COVID-19 pandemic. And several of his vetoes had a significant impact on the city of Kent, which we're going to get into as this presentation progresses. While the governor took a lot of early action with his vetoes, there is expected to be a significant revenue shortfall in the final budget that the governor signed into law. And as such, we're anticipating a special session will be called at some point between now and the end of the year, most likely after the June revenue forecast, so in the June, July, August timeframe. And to provide just a little bit of background on each of the supplemental budgets that were adopted to provide you some context of the legislature's work. The state operating budget funds all state agency operations, including K through 12 education, and it is also the budget that most state share revenues are allocated through. So your streamlined sales tax mitigation, criminal justice assistance account, liquor excise account, and liquor profit account. The state fiscal year runs July 1 of 2019 through June 30th of 2021. So again, this is the legislature coming in the middle of the fiscal year in order to make amendments. The legislature approved a operating budget that authorized $726 million in new expenditures and left $3 billion in reserves. This reflects a $235 million that the governor vetoed in expenditures. So the legislature had actually anticipated spending more than that $726 million without the governor's vetoes. And again, we're expecting a new revenue forecast in June that will likely report that revenues have declined rather significantly, which would require a revisiting of the state budget. The second budget that the state develops is a capital budget. It's bricks and mortar projects that are funded through cities and nonprofit organizations. It excludes transportation, so it's often park improvements, downtown improvements, things along those lines. Again, the supplemental budget was making amendments to the budget that was adopted in 2019. There was only $70 million in bond capacity reserved in 2019 for the development of a supplemental capital budget. So going into the 2020 legislative session, we knew that the supplemental budget was going to be extremely small, and that very much was the case. The final supplemental capital budget was $89.9 million, and the average project that was appropriated funds this past session was $217,000, which is significantly less than we typically see in a long session. The third budget that was adopted by the legislature is the supplemental transportation budget, and this was the one that was thought to be the most challenging. Prior to the beginning of the legislative session, voters had approved Initiative 976, which was the initiative instituting $30 car tabs. The passage of the initiative caused a $453 million. The legislature went in to make amendments to that biennium biennial budget, they had to reflect and make cuts that would equal that $453 million. In an effort to try and give the legislature ultimate flexibility on how to address that revenue shortfall, prior to the beginning of session, the governor paused all projects that were not yet underway. The supplemental transportation budget that was approved by the legislature removed all those paused projects and allowed them to proceed forward on schedule. But the way in which they did that is that they pushed out projects that were otherwise delayed, and they removed canceled projects. And that by pushing out those delayed projects, what it did is in the out years of the Connecting Washington package, so in the 21-23 biennium and in the 23-25 biennium, there is a revenue shortfall. So projects that are funded in those outer years now no longer have a guaranteed amount of funding. The shortfall in those outer years that is created by Initiative 976 creates an increased amount of pressure on the legislature to develop a transportation revenue package. I would note that this is further enhanced by the significant decline in gas tax revenues that the state is experiencing right now as part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot of pressure to figure out how to raise transportation revenue in order to fund the many different needs throughout the state. This past session in the Senate, we saw the Senate Chair of the Transportation Committee, Senator Steve Hobbs, draft a transportation package proposal and associated project list. He did this in 2019 and then revised it during the 2020 session. It's anticipated that further revisions would be made to that proposal as we look toward the 2021 legislative session. In the House, the work to develop a formal transportation package proposal has not yet occurred. It is likely to occur prior to the 2021 session. But what they did consider was a proposal to incrementally increase the gas tax by 9.7 cents over the next 10 years to fund state-owned culverts. And then they accepted project applications from different communities to begin developing that project list. So they introduced some key legislation and began taking action to develop a project list in order to begin developing a transportation package proposal. In addition to the development around a transportation package, we saw dozens of legislators sign a letter indicating to the legislature that in order for them to approve a transportation revenue package, that a low carbon fuel standard would need to be instituted and put in place. So those two policy issues moving forward are going to be very closely connected. So that's a brief overview of what happened this past legislative session broadly, as well as some context for the operating, capital, and transportation budgets, as well as what we anticipate happening on the development of a transportation revenue package. With that, I'd like to transition to talking a bit more about the City of Kent's specific top legislative priorities. I've included on this slide each of the top legislative priorities that you all identified and approved prior to the beginning of the legislative session. Top of that list, of course, is continue and replace streamlined sales tax mitigation payments. That is what we communicated to our legislative delegation as the #1 and top priority. The capital funding and transportation funding requests that we developed were really more about laying the groundwork for future funding opportunities rather than looking for successes this session. So really, I would say 95%, if not more, of our time and energy and effort was spent on streamlined sales tax mitigation and advancing that issue. So with that, we'll go into a little bit of detail on what happened with SST. As a reminder, in 2019, The legislature chose to fund the mitigation payments through June 30th of 2021, so through the current fiscal biennium. They also scheduled for those payments to continue through the 21 and 23 biennium. While they scheduled it to continue through 2023, that really doesn't mean much unless they appropriate the funds. So for certain, we knew that we would be receiving the funds through June 30th of 2021. Also in 2019, we floated two bills, House Bill 1948 and Senate Bill 5862, which would have transitioned the streamlined sales tax mitigation payments into warehousing and manufacturing assistant payments. So we rebranded the name of the payments and would have continued those assistance payments for 10 years. We got a lot of support in the House in 2019, but it was very clear that the members of the Senate Ways and Means Committee were not supportive of the proposal. So between the 2019 legislative session and the 2020 legislative session, we spent a lot of time meeting with Senate Ways and Means Committee members to understand their concerns and identify some alternative paths forward. As we went into the 2020 legislative session, our request was to continue SST mitigation payments, but also to consider replacing mitigation payments, either with the warehousing and manufacturing assistant payment proposal that we had developed in 2019, or with a new proposal that we developed with the Senate Ways and Means Committee members, which was Senate Bill 6474. And would have provided sales tax diversification awards to each of the cities that continue to receive streamlined sales tax mitigation. The sales tax diversification awards would be a 10-year credit against the state sales tax. However, what you can spend the money on would have been extremely limited to just infrastructure improvements that would spur economic development. However, the 10-year commitment, once authorized, wouldn't have been able to be amended by the legislature in any way. So there was kind of pros and cons of both approaches. And our approach was to tell the legislature, we want your assistance in finding a replacement for streamlined sales tax mitigation. And we're content with either of these as a path forward. Inevitably, the legislature chose to pass House Bill 1948. However, the Senate Ways and Means Committee amended the bill in order to fund the payments through 2026, so for only 5 years rather than 10 years. When they did that, we created the new account as part of the rebranding. They transferred the SST mitigation payment that we were scheduled to receive from July 1 of 2020 to June 30th of 2021, which is 6.7 million statewide. For the city of Kent, it's 3.5 million about. Anyway, they transferred that into a new account. The governor then vetoed the bill and vetoed the transfer into the new account. And the governor did this as part of his early action cost savings efforts. We immediately pushed back on that veto because the governor had indicated that his vetoes were focused on new spending that was authorized by the legislature. And this was not new spending. This was a continuation of spending that had previously been authorized in 2019. Our legislative delegation, as well as each of the SST mitigation cities, have now sent a letter to the governor's office asking him to reevaluate this veto and identify a way of essentially undoing this $6.7 million transfer. We have not yet heard back from the governor's office on whether or not there's a mechanism in which he can do that. Or whether there's a willingness on his part to do that. I'll share that I'm not overly optimistic that the governor has the authority to do that. I think it's more likely that we will need to work with the legislature in order to undo this veto through a special session. I'll also share that I think that is particularly challenging given that the state is looking at significant decline in revenue. And while they understand that the city is also looking at a significant decline in revenue, they're very focused on how the state can resolve the state budget problems. Assuming we can't get the veto reversed, the final SST mitigation payment that the city of Kent will receive will be on June 30th of 2020. We wouldn't receive any funding moving forward. As we look at a special session, which again is likely to occur after a June revenue forecast, this is where we will be spending a lot of our time and energy. I think because streamlined sales tax is the city's top priority, I will pause there to just see if there are any questions specific to SST. And Kim or others, I don't know how you guys want to do this as far as folks maybe just chime in. I
Sure,
can't see.
thanks, Briahna. Any questions or comments for Briahna on the SST or where she is so far?
I have a question, Council President.
Yep, Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Briahna, and thank you, Council President, as well. So do you know for his new funding, what percentage of new funding was not touched? I noticed he went after the SST, right? But you were saying there was new funding. I was wondering, do you know how much new funding was not cut as part of his veto?
Yes. So I'm just going to go back to an earlier slide here. So the legislature authorized $726 million in new spending was not vetoed.
And was not vetoed. And do you know how much was vetoed?
235.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm tracking it now. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you.
That's great. Any other questions on streamlined sales tax?
All right, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay. So we'll move on to capital funding then, and I'll keep this somewhat brief. Again, we developed some capital funding requests for 2020, really to begin laying the groundwork for the 2021 legislative session, because there were so limited funding opportunities in 2020 in the capital funding arena. We identified two different capital funding requests. The first was a $3 million request to develop phase 1 of Panther Lake Community Park. And the second was a $3 million request for the Gateway to Kent. We do typically develop two capital funding requests, one in the 33rd and one in the 47th legislative districts, so that we are able to work with all members of the legislative delegation on securing capital funding. Our advocacy effort this past session, as far as laying our groundwork, included completing the one-pagers and submitting funding request forms in both the House and the Senate. We also got really good feedback from our legislative delegations. One piece of notable feedback was, as we move forward with these requests, to ensure that the Gateway to Kent project is clearly described as a capital funding request rather than a transportation request. Because we've done this early groundwork, laying of the groundwork, I would encourage the city to continue to keep these as priorities as we move forward to 2021. There's also already a lot of discussion at the state level around the development of capital and transportation funding as part of the economic recovery efforts. And I could see these projects fitting in well with that economic recovery effort. On the transportation funding side, there were really 4 items that we worked on. The first of which was in response to the revenue shortfall from Initiative 976, and that was asking for on-time completion of State Route 509. The second 2 projects, completing 224th and allocating funding to Meet Me on Meeker, were requests we had in the development of the next transportation revenue package. And then finally, we put forward, along with Association of Washington Cities, a proposal that would have increased the different revenue authorities available to the city in order to fund your local street maintenance needs. And that builds on a statewide study that identified it's not just the city of Kent that has a revenue shortfall in meeting street maintenance needs, but that across all cities, there's over $900 million in unmet transportation maintenance needs. So on the on-time completion of State Route 509, we worked with a broader coalition that has long supported the completion of that project to send a letter to transportation budget writers urging on-time delivery and removing any pause on the project. The legislature authorized all pause projects, including State Route 509, to proceed forward on schedule. And I'll also note that I've been in touch with DOT since the COVID pandemic has begun, and there has been no slowing down of the work on State Route 509 as a result of the pandemic. As you may have seen in the media, there are several projects that were put on pause. However, the work that was being done on State Route 509 was work that could be done remotely. And so that work has continued to move forward on schedule. As we look forward to 509 in the future, the biggest concern is that the revenue shortfalls in the out years of the transportation budget put into question whether or not they can meet all the funding commitments that they have made. So we will need to continue to advocate for 509 moving forward. For both completing 224th and Meet Me on Meeker, we submitted the application forms in the House to have those projects included on as part of the House proposed transportation revenue package that's being developed over this interim, but we're not currently included on any of the proposed project lists. So to secure funding for these two projects moving forward, we're going to have to continue to do a lot of advocacy work with our legislative delegation. And then finally, on the local transportation funding proposal, we had two bills introduced, House Bill 2362 and Senate Bill 6652. Really good public hearing on those proposals. They would have authorized councilmanic sales tax, utility tax, and fuel tax authority for cities in order to meet transportation maintenance needs. But they did not advance any further than the public hearing stage. So again, that is one that will require more work moving forward. In addition to your top legislative priorities, the city develops a policy document. And it's a multi-page document that goes through each department and identifies various bills that the city would support. Additionally, as bills are introduced during the legislative process, I flag them for city staff and get input from city staff and the mayor's office on direction on which bills to support and oppose. And you often see the result of that in my weekly reports that you receive throughout the legislative session. Of the items on the policy document, I wanted to highlight just a few. The first is there was a bill that was passed making an amendment to the Public Records Act that exempt the year of birth, photographs, and payroll deductions for public employees and volunteers in personnel files. The exception to that is that news media would still have access to full birth dates and photographs. We supported that proposal as a common sense reform to the Public Records Act. The second proposal is around economic development. It would have provided a new round of funding into the local revitalization financing program. This program, as well as other economic development programs, could be very helpful to the city of Kent. This bill made it a long ways through the legislative process, but died in one of the final stages. And I expect economic development efforts along these lines to be part of AWC and the city's broader efforts on economic recovery efforts. On affordable housing, we spent a lot of time and energy on House Bill 2907 and House Bill 2948, which would have imposed a payroll excise tax in King County. The proposal was very concerning when it was first introduced. and in large part because no one from the city was consulted in the development of the proposal. Really no one from King County cities broadly was consulted in the development of the proposal. We provided a lot of input into amendments to the bill to make sure that any revenue generated under the proposal would have been equitably spent throughout the county, and to ensure that there was adequate reporting requirements, that the thresholds for the impact to businesses were clear, that there was a greater understanding to which businesses would have been impacted by this proposal. Inevitably, all of the concerns raised by not just us, but other stakeholders could not be addressed. And the bill died toward the end of session. And the only thing I'd note is just for an issue that was not a top legislative priority for the city, this issue consumed a significant amount of my time as well as city staff time, as we provided input into how to improve the proposal. The second bill on affordable housing was House Bill 1590. It did pass into law. It authorizes counties to councilmanically increase the sales tax to fund affordable housing. King County has until September 30th in order to impose the tax. And if they have not imposed it by September 30th, then that authority transitions to the city. In addition to that policy bill, the legislature also allocated $160 million in new funding for housing and homelessness programs. Just a couple more policy document highlights. We, similar to previous years, saw several proposals introduced that would have preempted local control on land use regulations. Through working with a group of legislators that we refer to as the House Local Government Champions, we were able to defend against the passage of these bills, with the exception of one. Senate Bill 6617 passed, and it limits cities from having on-site parking requirements for accessory dwelling units within a quarter mile of a transit stop that receives service every 15 minutes. This is a significantly narrow version of the bill that passed into law. Initial versions would have removed city authority on regulation of accessory dwelling units in nearly every scenario. So this very narrow version did seem more amenable than the earlier versions. The second item on the slide is some legislation that we worked on to extend the deadline for the city to join the File Local platform for administering business licenses. This is a proposal that only impacted the city of Kent. We worked closely with the city's legislative delegation, as well as the Department of Revenue and the National Federation of Independent Businesses, to develop and advance the proposal. House Bill 2749 was introduced that effectively made the change. Representative Tina Orwell championed the issue for us. And while that particular bill did not pass, the content of the bill was integrated into another bill toward the end of the legislative session and was signed into law. So overall, we were able to get the deadline extended as we needed through this effort. And then state shared revenues, for the most part, remain fully funded with the exception of streamlined sales tax mitigation. And then I've put this note for now because I'm very concerned that as the state looks at how to balance its revenue shortfall, it will look toward those other state shared revenue accounts and make reductions in those areas in a special session. So we are very much paying attention to what we're hearing around a special session. I'll just on this slide want to call out that we once again made an effort to replace the 1% property tax cap with inflation and population, but did not make much progress. The proposal was introduced but died. We also tried to get councilmanic sales tax authority to fund park improvements and park maintenance and operations. That proposal also did not pass into law. We did secure funding for 2 additional courses through the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. That was a new spending item that was not vetoed by the governor. So just a highlight of a new spending item that was finalized. And then finally, we supported the statewide plastic bag ban that was passed into law and sponsored by one of our delegation members. So as we look at next steps, as I've mentioned, a special session is likely right after we see the next revenue forecast in June. Once we get through any special session, the November 2020 election cycle is likely to change the makeup of the legislature. We have over a dozen different legislators that have announced their retirements. So there's a lot of open seats. So we'll have a lot of new faces in Olympia. All members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election, as well as approximately half the Senate. The legislature will meet for pre-session committee days in September and December, which are key lobbying opportunities for the city to get our issues heard early. And then the 2021 legislative session will begin on January 11th of 2021. And with that, I will pause for questions. I will note, I think many of you know I'm about 7 months pregnant, and I ran into some pregnancy complications throughout session. And I just really want to extend my great appreciation to the mayor and to city staff, as well as to my team at Gordon Thomas Honeywell, Shelley and Holly, for allowing me to have some flexibility in managing all of that and continuing to advocate for all of you through this process. So with that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
So questions for Briahna. Councilmember Boyce?
Thank you, Madam President. I guess once again, Brad, I'm gonna go back to this SST, right? I think the state, like a lot of part of the economy, is gonna be in a world of trouble for a long time, right? So by the governor vetoing that, I mean, how do you see this coming back to the table? I mean, there's gonna be a shortage of funding and revenue coming in. I mean, how do you see that working itself back in the scene?
Yeah, our best case messaging for a special session is for the legislature to understand that the governor's veto was not a veto of new spending, but a veto of existing spending that we had already been relying on, and to outline for the legislature, and we've done this with our immediate delegation, but taking it broadly, that cities are facing revenue shortfalls as well, and proactively adding an additional cut on top of that revenue shortfall is really pouring salt into an open wound, and not something the legislature would want to do at this time. I think you're right in questioning whether or not we'll be successful with that messaging. I don't know. I mean, I think it's going to be really challenging. But if we don't ask, we won't be successful. So I think we need to, at a minimum, ask the legislature to consider reversing the veto.
And I get that. And thank you very much. I just think about the time it took us to get here, right? Forever and ever. And then have it go away. I just think it's going to be a steep hill to climb. And you're right. We need to continue asking. So thank you. And last, I want to say congratulations on your pregnancy. So I hope all will go well with you. Thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Any other comments or questions from council members?
Madam Chair,
Yeah, Councilmember Thomas, go ahead.
in my 16 years on this council and 5 years in the House of Representatives, I can't remember a more depressing report. Sorry, Briahna.
No, that's fair. After the governor vetoed our bill that I worked so diligently to get passed with our legislative delegation, I was depressed for quite some time.
I bet.
So I agree. I am extremely disappointed by the legislative session. I will note our legislative delegation worked so hard on our behalf to get House Bill 1948 passed.
Yeah.
Senator Dawes, Representative Sullivan, Representative Entenman, Senator Kaiser, who's serves on the Ways and Means Committee and was just diligent in working this issue through that committee. Senator Hasagawa is on the same committee as well. Representative Orwell, Representative Gregerson, Representative Hudgens, and Representative Berkowitz, all of them, they worked so hard to get this bill passed. And I think they were just as depressed as I was, and I'm sure all of you are, that the governor then chose to veto it. We did make a very concerted effort to try and get in front of the veto and explain to the staff in the governor's office how this is not new spending. But they seem to take a very black and white view of new spending as they were looking at vetoes. So fair assessment, very depressing. I agree.
I can't wait till the next report of yours.
I'll try and make sure it's more cheery.
Thank you, Councilmember Kaur.
Thank you, Chair. Briahna, I just want to say thank you so much for all the work you did. When we were there for AWC lobby days, you were amazing. Even though being super pregnant, you were so amazing, working hard. So thank you so much for all you're doing, and good luck to you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Kind of echoing on Councilmember Kaur's comments. I know the mayor and several of us attended came to Olympia to meet with our legislators and talk to them about priorities, and you helped set up those meetings, and between you and your staff accompanied us to meet with a lot of those legislators, and it made a difference in some things. So I appreciate that, and I want to say thank you so much to you, and best of luck to you. Congratulations.
Great. Well, thank you, and it really is my pleasure. You guys have an excellent city staff that gets me information in a timely manner, and you all are always willing to come down to Olympia. I know the mayor spent a lot more time in Olympia than she could have ever wanted to spend, even on Saturdays, sitting in Ways and Means Committee members. And all of this is a team effort, and you guys are part of that team. City staff is part of the team, and I think collectively, despite the depressing presentation, we were as about effective as we could be this past session.
Thank you. We definitely have challenges ahead of us. Any other questions or comments for Briahna before we move on?
Madam President?
Yes, go ahead, Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Madam President. Could I hear anything from the mayor and her response to this report? Dana, are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Council President and council members. So we'll start with, you're absolutely right. The news of the veto came as a huge disappointment. But what I would rather focus on, honestly, and because we're dealing with it, right? We're doing everything we can in the background to figure out how to help the governor's office correct what we think was a terrible mistake. I just want to take a chance to say thank you to Briahna and Holly and everyone on their team. The amount of time that they put in during this session, during a short session, mind-boggling. And it was a team effort. We made lots of trips. We talked to lots of people, but none of that would have been possible without Briahna and her team. Setting it up, grabbing folks in the hall. Councilmember Thomas, you know how that works, right? It's a complicated dance, and could not be more grateful to have Briahna and Holly on our side through this process. We will continue to work with the governor's office. I brought it up on a call that we were on with him last week, as did Mayor Backus. I've got a call, a group call with him again tomorrow. We will bring it up again tomorrow and just keep on doing everything we can. It's disappointing when you see the amount of new spending that was approved and what was cut, that Kent was hit so significantly by those cuts and the other funding that did go forward. So we're going to keep trying.
Thank you.
Hey, Madam President, or Kim, can we get a copy of this report, please?
As Kim is unmuting herself, I'll just chime in and say, in addition to this presentation, you all will be receiving from me a full comprehensive written report that goes through all the bills that we tracked and took a position on. And that will go out in the same manner in which the weekly reports that I send go out. And so look for that in your inbox. And I'm always available for follow-up questions or comments. If you have those, feel free to email me or give me a call on my cell phone.
Thank you so much, Briahna. Anybody else have anything before we move on?
I'm taking my antidepressant pills as we talk.
All right. Thanks so much, Briahna. And again, congratulations, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which I think means it goes back to Kim's.
All right, we're going to move on in the presentations. Next, we have payment of bills. We will move that forward to consent calendar. And then I believe we are changing our speaker, and it's going to be Terry Youngman talking about fee in lieu of the fourth quarter 2019 and first quarter of 2020.
Yes, thank you, Madam President. This is Terry Youngman, Park Planning and Development Manager in the Parks Department. I'm here today to present an item to accept $69,750.64 in fee in lieu funding and amend the Community Parks Reinvestment Program budget, which authorizes these funds to be spent on two projects, one at Kent Memorial Park and one at Chestnut Ridge Park. These funds were paid by two developers. The first developer was IHB Architects. They built a two-story apartment building in the amount of $54,375.64. This amount is being allocated to Kent Memorial Park. The second development was Dada Sheetal for nine single-family residential lots in the amount of $15,375, and that is being allocated to Chestnut Ridge Park. Both of these are planned projects, and they will leverage these fee in lieu funds with existing parks capital funding, which we have allocated through the 6-year capital plan process. So these are projects that are already in motion. We are simply leveraging these funds with those to be able to produce a better project. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Terry? All right, so as long as there's no objections, we'll go ahead and move this on to the consent calendar. Anybody have any objections? All right, and then I believe you are up for the next presentation.
Yes, thank you. So additionally, I'm presenting an item to reallocate $18,600 fee in lieu funds from Springwood Park to Wilson Playfield, kind of dating back as to when these funds were originally allocated back in January of 2016. At that time, we had allocated them to Springwood Park. That was a planned project, something that was slated for a master plan and redevelopment. Because of the pace of that project and the need to expend these funds within a 5-year period, we are going to reallocate these funds to a currently planned project at Wilson Playfield to expend them before the 5-year deadline, which is upcoming in 2021. We have confirmed that this reallocation does not impact the overall budget for Springwood Park. That project is still currently slated for a master plan in 2020 and would proceed as normal despite this reallocation.
All right, so again, any questions or comments? Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Manager. Just for clarity, so we're removing this 18,006, and you said have no impact on the entire future budget for Springwood. Do that mean that this 18,000 was more and greater than what we're going to be spending on Springwood? I'm just trying to connect.
So this is we consider these fee in lieu cases because they're relatively modest in terms of their amount. They're generally supplemental to any B&O or REIT funding that we allocate to our projects. You know, the improvements at Springwood Park, as we currently have them planned, would be, you know, a multi-million-dollar project. And so this amount of funding would just be additive to what we had allocated for that overall project budget. It helps kind of support additional scope. And if we have phased improvements, it helps us get to some of those additional pieces or elements within the park. But again, what we're saying is that although these funds are being reallocated for administrative purposes, I'm sure there are going to be additional fee-in-lieu funds that will continue to come in this area. We'll be looking at Springwood Park as a very likely candidate for future funds for fee-in-lieu. And I'm just saying that it does not impact our allocations through REIT and B&O for Springwood Park.
And I get that and thinking one last follow-up. So, parks, we always kind of get hammered when we do something with parks and so on. I'm not sure where this park is located. As far as the neighborhood with this park and so on, I'm not sure we need to communicate it, but if someone read about this here and say, hey, you're taking away from our park, how could we respond to this here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to have those conversations if they were to come up. We are going to be very much on the forefront of conversations with the communities, Birch Creek neighborhood, single family residential that surrounds that area. So we're going to be very much connected with those communities as we move forward with the master plan process there. And we'll be very transparent about our overall budget for the project and what funding is coming in. So if they have questions about it, I'm happy to walk them through our budgeting process and what's allocated through the 6-year plan to be sure that they are not getting shortchanged in all of the administration of these funds that's required.
So we as council member, right? So what I'm hearing you saying, if we get questioned about this here, our answer would be that with the master plan that we have for the parks here, this 18,000 is not going to impact it. We still have our plan together to improve the parks, and the reason why we moved this 18,000 is because of the deadline of spending the fund. Is that correct?
That's right. That's correct. And I would say that master plan, that master plan will result in an estimate, a budget estimate that will further define the funding that we would allocate to this park. We move forward with an assumption of how much money should be assigned to a park of this scale and size. But a lot of that has to be truthed through a master plan process. We go in with some assumptions and an overall budget that gets refined further as we go through a master plan process. Then it gets refined further as we go through a design process. And so we start with a certain set of assumptions now, and we look to clarify that as we move forward.
And my last question, forgive me, on the Springwood Park. So when are we scheduled to make the big investment with the master plan? And that's a couple of years down the road, or do you?
Yeah, I would say that that's a good estimate. A master plan process plus this conceptual design, I think, is going to take us about a year to get through. That's obviously, looking at complications with COVID-19, it makes it very challenging for us to have public meetings. That's very core to us being able to do this master plan update, is to meet with the community members, understand their wants and needs, and being able to incorporate that into a meaningful design process. And so obviously that's, has a caveat of what we're able to do. But we are looking at innovative ways to be able to have virtual meetings and meet with the public through alternative means. And so I would say generally, we're probably at least a couple of years out from having that first phase of construction of Springwood Park. But look to expedite that process as much as possible as we move forward.
And thank you for your thorough answer. And I guess to my fellow council member, we just need to keep this in mind because, we do get questioned about fundings and part and so on. And just be clear that this doesn't impact the overall plan for what we plan on doing with the parks. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm sure there may be questions. Thank you, Council President.
Great comments, Councilmember Boyce, and thank you, Terry, for that explanation and clarification. Councilmember Thomas, do you have a comment?
I do actually. Question for you, Madam President. The reallocation of these funds over to Wilson Fields, what will those funds be used for?
So we have a planned project at Wilson. It is for a picnic shelter so we currently have a space for it. We actually have the concrete pad there as well. And this is a unit that we would likely buy as a prefabricated unit. So the installation of this is relatively simple. That's why we've identified this project, because it can move forward relatively quickly. The permitting is relatively simple, and it's something that's been planned for Wilson Playfield for some time. So that's why this project's been selected. It's for its expediency and ease, so that we can get these funds expended well in advance of that deadline.
All right, thank you.
All right, any other comments or questions? All right, thank you so much for that presentation.
Thank you, Madam President.
We are going to move on, and I'm going to welcome Chief Padilla. He's going to talk to us about a resolution for the Puget Sound Emergency Radio Network, an ILA, and an MOU.
Hey, good evening. Thank you. Exactly. So I'll be presenting and seeking adoption of the Puget Sound Emergency Radio Network, PCERN, ILA, and MOU. Just quick background on that. PCERN is replacing the old emergency or King County Emergency Radio Network. That project or system is 20 years old and is significantly outdated and soon won't be supported by Motorola Radio Corporation very much longer. So if you recall, the old system or network was consisted of 4 owner entities, including the City of Seattle, King County, Eastside Public Safety Communications, and Valley Communications, which Kent is an owner city of. Voters approved PCERN back in 2015. They specifically approved a tax levy lid lift, and the budget for the project was set at $283 million. So what are we getting by going to PCERN? Overall, it's just a better system. It improves radio coverage, capacity for more radios on the system, capabilities. There's new features that are enhanced with the system, and better interoperability throughout King County. As you know, in times of disasters or major critical incidents, the ability to cross jurisdictions and even emergency personnel disciplines to ensure communications continue is a huge deal. So it moves all of our radios from analog to digital, and it's basically, just like I said earlier, a huge improvement for our first responders and other emergency government personnel. So highlights of the ILA and MOU and what we're seeking approval on is that these documents designate King County as the lead agency for the initial planning and procurement, financing, and some initial operations of PCERN. From there, it also establishes a new entity called PCERN Operator. That would be the governing entity at that point, and it establishes a board of directors, of which Valley Communications retains the right to have a representative member, which will include either a mayor or city manager from one of the owner cities. It also permanently provides Valleycom and subsequently the city of Kent a seat on the governing board, ensuring that this regional asset meets the needs of the Kent community. So we're seeking your support on that, and I take any questions.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Councilmember Boyce.
Thank you, Madam President. Hey, Chief, I'm assuming this would also apply to the RFA as well, too, right? This system here. Do you know?
Correct.
Right. Thank you.
And Chief Padilla, this is Council President Troutner. When will this all take place? Is there a timeline when everybody will be using this?
So there's been work going on since 2015, and so the system isn't currently online. We're told that we're going to start seeing some of the first radios in operation in 2021. We don't expect for the City of Kent, particularly the police department, to be fully operational until 2022.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments for the chief? All right. We are going to move on. Your chief is going to continue and talk about the 2020 Department of Justice grant for the Coronavirus Emergency Supplement Funding Program.
All right, thank you. So about a month ago, we got word of an opportunity through the Department of Justice. City of Kent was specifically identified as one of, I believe, 36 cities in the state of Washington being designated as a high need for funding to combat Corona. And so we got to work right away. It was a pretty quick turnaround on the grant. Sarah did a fantastic job on that, and we got an award in the amount of $122,683. The grant provides funding to assist eligible local units of government, tribes, and state for preparing and responding to coronavirus epidemic. We can use the money to prepare for and respond, and it allows us to purchase equipment, so personal protective gear. It allows us to fund overtime. It allows us to hire sanitizing supplies, training, travel, and other medical needs for for instance, say our inmates at the Kent jail, those are acceptable uses of the funding. So specifically at this time, however, we're looking at sanitizing equipment for vehicles and buildings, personal protective equipment. We are purchasing 5 Virex Plus, I'll say, try to get this right, electrostatic sprayers and disinfectant solutions. So many of you may have seen the sprayers that they're using on the planes. They look like giant super soaker guns, and they spray sanitizer in large amounts to clear large areas quickly. We will soon have 5 of those, and we're deploying that both at the police department, substations, and the jail. And it also includes, our request specifically includes technology enhancements to increase the mobility of emergency personnel operations. And what that means is we are realizing that while we were pretty well set up to take all operations mobile, there were some aspects, particularly in our detectives unit and some of our command structure, where if we had to stay in our vehicles and not actually respond to the headquarters or physical building, we needed some technology in the form of laptops or Microsoft Surface computers. So we will be purchasing that. That will set us up well for the future. A couple interesting or unique things about the grant. Most of our grants have to go through a parent agency like Seattle or King County. This one is being directly funded to Kent, which is significantly streamlining the timeline. It's also retroactive. So anything that we've spent up to this point, which we have been tracking in terms of equipment and other things, we can charge to this grant. So it's not a huge amount of money, but in these difficult times, we were very fortunate to be awarded it. And there you go.
Well, great news. Good to know too that we can go back and get some of those funds that we've already spent. So always good news to get a grant. Any questions or comments? Councilmember Boyce.
Hey, thanks, Chief. I'm wondering, are there any other funding you are trying to get with this coronavirus? That is great. It's 122,000. I'm wondering, are there anything else that you have in scope that you're trying to get funding for? Or this is it?
We are looking at anything that comes available. We're hoping that with some of the secondary budget packages coming through the federal government, we may see some opportunities, and we'll certainly jump on those. Currently, we're not aware of any new ones.
All right. Any other questions or comments for the chief? All right. If we can go back to that previous presentation on the resolution for the emergency radio network. Before we need to move this on to the consent calendar. Are there any objections to moving it on? All right. First, Councilmember Fincher, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Council President. I just wanted to say how happy I was at that grant, that the police department got that grant. I was really surprised to find out early on in this emergency that our police officers and other law enforcement officers weren't considered tier 1 and tier 2 as far as being able to receive PPE and other protective equipment from the county and some of the sources that were available early on. So congratulations on getting this grant, and stay safe. One other question though, on just reading through the grant, have we had this type of grant before where, and I realize that COVID-19, not necessarily for COVID-19, but I'm wondering about the administration of the grant, all the record keeping. Do we expect it to be any more extraneous than other grants, or do you have any idea, Chief?
I do not expect it to be any different from, we have a long history of managing federal grants, so it shouldn't be an issue. Like I said, I think the only difference is the streamlined approach to this. It comes directly to us, which is nice because typically it goes to a third party. It sits for a significant time. For instance, we're waiting for 2017 grant money to come through that just got awarded. So this streamlines it, and then the reporting is direct as well. We will report back to Department of Justice.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments or questions about the grant? All right. And is everybody okay moving the emergency radio ILA and MOU forward. Any objections?
Nope, sounds good.
All right, so we'll move that forward to the consent calendar. And we are ready to move on. Thank you, Chief, for that presentation. Now we are going to move on to a presentation on the interlocal agreement with City of Tukwila for the South 200th Street Bridge maintenance and repair.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. This is Joe Araucto over at Public Works Department, the utility engineer. I'm here to present information and answer questions related to the ILA for the maintenance and repair of the 200th Street Bridge over the Green River. As you can see in the presentation there, this is located on the west side, northwest side of the city along 200th Street Bridge. This is a vital access to our Kent Manufacturing Industrial Center to I-5. Bridge was constructed in 1988 in partnership with King County. Since Tukwila's 2009 annexation, the bridge has been co-owned by Kent and Tukwila. I work directly with Tukwila's transportation project manager, who worked cooperatively to draft this agreement, and this agreement has been reviewed and by both Kent and Tukwila's legal counsel. Highlights of the ILA: this creates a two-person administrative board comprising of the two public works director or their designee to oversee the performance of the obligation of this this agreement, and it basically memorializes the current practices that we have. So City of Kent will continue to perform snow removal and apply de-icing on the bridge when weather dictates. Continue to perform sidewalk sweeping and painting of the lines on the bridge. Tukwila will always maintain and manage all of the costs associated with the bridge studies and required bridge inspections. Those occur at a very regular basis every 24 months. All of those inspections are all due by next year. Each city will be responsible for the approaches to their respective side of the bridge, and graffiti removal is also defined in the agreement. Major repairs are identified as split equally between the city if there are any identified repairs that are needed based on the previous inspection that I mentioned. Tukwila has recently presented this to their transportation committee and is also scheduled to move this forward to their full council for their approval on their next opportunity. And I'm here seeking support of this ILA. Any questions? I'm here.
Thank you. Any questions about moving this forward or comments about the presentation? All right, I don't see any hands raised. So again, this is just kind of the right thing to do. There haven't been any complications between who repairs or maintains the bridge. This is just kind of making a formal process.
That is correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any concerns about moving this forward or any objections? All right, we will go ahead and move this forward then to the consent calendar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to swap a couple items here. We are going to swap item I for H in the agenda lineup. So I'd like to welcome April and some people from King County Metro. We're going to talk about the South Base update first.
Thank you. This is April Delchamps in the Public Works Department. King County Metro is here to provide an update on the new South King County bus base. And Jeff Arbuckle, who is the Capital Projects Managing Supervisor, will be giving the presentation. He is also on the line.
Thank you, April. King County Metro appreciates the council's time, and we're excited to be engaging with the city of Kent on our new South King County base. If we can go to the next slide. The past several years have shown rapid growth for King County, with South King County being the recipient of much of that growth. In order to align our service and support regional growth, King County Metro released Metro Connects in 2017, a visionary approach to our future service through 2040. That growth included 2.5 million more service hours and grows our fleet by over 40%. Supporting these additional coaches requires additional maintenance and operations space for the county. Go to the next slide. In 2018, Metro began development of the Operational Capacity Growth Program to accommodate the planned growth. This program focuses on effective short and long-term solutions for increasing Metro's operational capacities by enhancing our operations in the Central Business District, increasing our short and long-term capacities at our campus in Tukwila, and adding a new campus in South King County to better support our South End service. Next slide. Our new base in South King County is expected to maximize the time a bus spends in revenue service, reducing time spent traveling without riders by siting a facility near the start or end point of our routes. This new facility is expected to make meaningful contributions to the community by improving the air quality in South King County by deploying an all-electric fleet, while also limiting noise impacts associated with bus travel. The investment will provide Metro an opportunity to explore a variety of partnerships in the community, including training and apprenticeship programs, which may spur economic development, and providing approximately 400 to 600 jobs during planning, construction, and long-term operations at the facility. We'd expect localized impacts with growth in patronage to existing and future local retail establishments near the base. Next slide. The new South King County base supports 250 electric buses with an estimated cost of $480 million, which includes purchasing a site and building and opening the base as soon as 2030. We do not expect this facility to look like our existing bases. Depending on the siting and community needs, Metro will consider a mix of uses on site. The included images reflect the industry's next generation of bus depots in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, highlighting a modernized, less industrial architecture and mixed-use transit operations. Our facility in Kent could include co-location opportunities for the city, training and apprenticeship facilities, community spaces, or other mixed-use and commercial retail developments. We conducted a land search in South King County, identifying and evaluating 20 sites against criteria including the compatibility of existing and surrounding land use requirements, reasonable availability for future development, avoidance of sensitive environmental areas, and opportunities to advance King County's social equity and sustainability goals. We're targeting a buildable site of approximately 30 acres with good access to major freeways or arterial roads. Evaluation and analysis of the candidate sites generated a top 3 list of potential sites in South King County, with 2 being in Auburn, 1 in Kent. Our first site is located in Kent at South 196th Street and 68th Avenue South. Configuration of the site is an ideal shape for a bus base, and it is flat and open. The site has good access from all surrounding streets and is large enough to accommodate a 250 bus base with additional space for additional functions, mixed-use development, and/or future expansion. Our second site is located in Auburn at South 277th Street and D Street Northeast. Configuration of the site is an ideal shape for a bus base, and it is relatively flat and open. The site has good access from 3 sides, although there is a current residential development underway on the southern edge of the site, which has limited the available size of the development. Our third site is in Auburn at 37th Street Northwest and B Street Northwest. Configuration of the site is an ideal shape for a bus base, and the site is relatively flat. It's large enough to accommodate a 250 bus base with additional space for other functions, mixed-use development, or future expansion, and access is limited due to adjacent rail lines and wetlands. Metro publicly announced the 3 candidate sites on June 26, 2019 through a press release and other media channels with the goal of opening communications with key stakeholders and the public about the site selection process. Regional tribes were notified informally prior to the press release through King County's executive office. We also notified state legislatures in the district that the 3 sites were located. We conducted a survey in late October through mid-November to gather a baseline understanding of Auburn and Kent communities' perception of a potential bus base in their area. We promoted the survey through a mailer and concurrent outreach for other Metro programs in South King County. Auburn and Kent neighborhood coordinators were also provided the survey information and a link to distribute to their communities. Our survey was available in English, Russian, Spanish, Vietnamese, simplified Chinese, and traditional Chinese. We had 188 respondents, 65 self-identified as being from Kent. 41% of those were familiar with Metro's plans to build a base in South King County, and 51% of those from Kent felt positive about locating a new bus base in their communities. For those with a location preference, most wanted a bus base near their communities in anticipation of potential benefits, including access to a job opportunity and improvement to the physical look of empty vacant properties. Along with general support for locating the bus base in South King County, respondents also noted several concerns, including future impact to travel, construction disruptions, wear on roads, and increased traffic, as well as potential impacts to the surrounding environment. Metro has a strong commitment to our communities. We plan to engage Kent residents and keep them informed and involved in the site process. If the Kent site is selected, we will ensure public engagement during future phases of work. A prime example of this has occurred recently in part of our planning work for our South Campus in Tukwila. We hosted a community roundtable to help identify elements and amenities that could further equity and social justice in the local community. Attendees included our partners in education, Living Well Kent, Global to Local, and Environmental Coalition of South Seattle. Looking down the road, we're hoping to complete our site selection process and initiate the Federal Transit Administration's concurrency process by the end of the year, with a targeted acquisition completion by the end of 2024. Groundbreaking of the facility is expected in 2026, with the first buses rolling out approximately 2030. Thank you for the opportunity to share an update on our project. Further information is available at the web link provided above, and I'm more than happy to respond to any questions now or in the future via the contact information provided.
Thank you so much. Any questions or comments? Councilmember Boyce.
Hey, thank you, Madam President. Hey, Jeff, you say are these new jobs, all new jobs? And I'm curious how many, I didn't miss that. And what type of pay are these type of jobs we're talking about?
Metro is very focused on living wages jobs. So this would be based off service expansions to our system. So this would be new service add. Those new services would, of course, require new operators, new buses, new mechanics. So this would be a new facility rather than a replacement facility. So this would be new jobs brought into the Metro system, brought into the county. We are strong on living wage. I don't know the exact dollar amounts, but I'm sure we could have that figured out and sent to you depending on what the type of work is. And approximately how many new jobs you say, Jeff? Do you know? I believe we said 400 to 600 during the entire process. The bases themselves engage, I believe it's around 350 per base between drivers and between operators and mechanics and the folks that actually do the management work and the administration at the base. We're also considering, depending on the site, if it is large enough, we would relocate our safety and training center. There's a substantial amount of employment there. Our safety and training center is where all of our operators train to get their CDLs. So there's a lot of class work that goes on there. So there's a fairly large contingent there. So the specific jobs that will come to the site will be dependent upon how large the site is and how much we can accommodate on that site. And these jobs you're talking about, these are day-to-day job. We're not talking about the people who building the building, right? I mean, correct. The numbers I just quoted would be permanent jobs. Yes. During construction, we do have what is called a community workforce agreement for capital. Those community workforce agreements help us bring in folks from local communities and help support equity during our construction process as well. And I don't have exact numbers on the expected number of folks we bring in for construction. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Jeff on this presentation? All right. I don't see any other hands raised, so we are ready to move on to the King County Metro the King County Metro RapidRide I update.
And this is April again. Greg McKnight, who is the King County Metro Project Manager for RapidRide I, will be giving the presentation. And I failed to note earlier, Lauren Craig, who is also on the phone, to answer additional questions if they come up.
Hi, this is Greg McKnight. Can you hear me okay?
No, we cannot.
Is this better?
Much better.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, as April mentioned, my name is Greg McKnight. I'm a project manager at King County Metro, and I manage the RapidRide I line. And ready for the next slide. So today I want to talk a little bit about progress so far. I know I've chatted a few times with the council, but wanted to give an update, especially for those of us that haven't been paying attention on a daily basis, and talk about where we're moving next, which is moving into our design phase. And then we'll finish with some next steps. So if we go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the progress we've made. I know I came and talked to the council late last year, and we've done quite a bit since then. So next slide. We have just finished our conceptual design, which looked at the alignment and the station locations. Just a reminder, off to the side there, you see our area map where we're serving the Renton Transit Center down to Kent, down to Auburn Station. And what we've identified so far is that alignment and where those stations should be. We asked for a letter of support from you all, as well as the cities of Renton and Auburn at the end of last year. And that all went into a giant package that we went to our council, the King County Council, to kind of codify that alignment along with those station locations. And all of this we did in concurrence with our Renton, Kent, Auburn area mobility plan, which this group has heard some about, that's looking at a bigger network restructure in addition to setting this RapidRide alignment. So those have been ongoing. We just presented to our King County Council earlier today. So this is all moving along quite nicely right now. And I just want to make one last point that a lot of the progress we've made recently has also been in compliance with the goals set out by the city's transportation master plan. I know April has talked with you all a little bit about that in the past, and that's something that we want to continue to work with the city on. Next slide. So what have we heard in those first phases that really spoke to what we were trying to do? When we went out and talked to people, we really had, we heard over and over again that people wanted faster, more reliable, frequent bus service. People needed to get where they're going on time, and they wanted to know when the bus was coming. They wanted to feel safe. They wanted to feel that they had good connections to other transit options, and they want to make sure they can get to and from the station easily. So next slide. Some of the ways that we've been incorporating this in our conceptual plans to date, we really wanted to make sure we set that alignment to serve the most community assets, to make sure that we identify capital improvements to get the buses through traffic faster. And then we want to prioritize how we can improve safety and comfort at stations. Maybe it's via lighting, or it's better access or sidewalk improvements. And then also making sure that we're serving those key connections. I mentioned that partnership with the Renton, Kent, Auburn area mobility plan. We really want to make sure this RapidRide investment aligns with the community's needs to get throughout South King County. I did mention that this is going to be including elements that get people to and from the stations easier. So this is sidewalk improvements, crosswalks, pedestrian crossings of busy streets, and even bike infrastructure. Next slide. So now what we're doing is we're advancing into our design phase. Next slide. So where we're at, we have just finished that conceptual design and we're moving into final design. This is where we really sharpen our pencils and make sure that all of those priorities that we identified can really work, moving towards construction and the start of service. So what's all included in that final design phase? Right now, we're starting our 30% design. This is where we confirm what we proposed could actually work, making sure that those stations locations make sense. At first, we've just kind of said, hey, we think it should be at this intersection, and maybe on the far side of the intersection makes the most sense, but we can really actually get into the weeds and say, okay, no, it makes sense for it to be here as opposed to here, or maybe move it another 20 feet so we avoid some sort of impact. So that's what we're working on right now. And as you can see, we have a lot of work yet to do, and all of this will have a lot of input from the city. As April introduced me, I coordinate with her quite frequently, and we are going to continue this partnership as we move into this design phase. Next slide. So what are some of these improvements that we're looking at as far as the capital investments for the project? A lot of this is speed and reliability. So some of the projects that we try to identify to move into the design phase are giving transit priority to meet that goal that people want to get to the bus easier and get through traffic faster. So this is things like bus only lanes or shared turn lanes with buses, or even bus shoulder lanes if we're operating in that sort of facility. All of this to get around traffic easier. Next slide. We also look at how we interact at intersections. We have a system called transit signal priority, where a bus can actually talk to the traffic lights, and maybe that traffic light can give us a green light a little bit longer than it might have, or change some of the timing so that the bus can get through traffic faster. And then finally, with speed and reliability, we look at where those stations are at. I mentioned we really want to hone in that design right now. We can also think about whether the station is past an intersection or before an intersection, or maybe if the bus is turning, it makes sense to have it after the turn or before the turn. And our engineering really looks at what is the best way to design these stations to help get through traffic faster. So that's a lot of our capital investments around speed and reliability, but also we want to talk about stations. So I think in previous presentations, we've shown what our kit of parts will look like for the RapidRide investments. And I want to emphasize some of the aspects that we're really moving into this next phase of design that have been prioritized by the community and our input from the city. And those are things about comfort and convenience, such as having shelters for weather protection, benches and leaning rails for comfort, and then things like real-time information signs. If you know when the bus is coming, it's a lot easier to rely on it. In the next slide, we talk about some of our other functionality. We heard a lot about safety. People want to make sure that they feel safe when they're waiting for the bus or getting to the bus. So lighting is a huge part of that. We heard that from our coordination with the city as well as with the community, that is a priority we want to move into the design phase. And then finally, our last bit of capital investments that we're honing in on the design phase is our access to transit package. It's great to have a bus that moves fast. It's great to have a nice waiting area, but if you can't get to the bus stop, it doesn't really serve us very well. So we look at how we can improve access to transit. This is new crosswalks, improvements to sidewalks, improvements to crossings with new pedestrian signals, new curb ramps that meet ADA standards, and then even things like how biking can get to the station area with those sort of improvements. All of this is wrapped into our design phase to really make sure that we're having a holistic group of capital investments. So I want to talk a little bit about some of our next steps. So as we have been so far, one of our big next steps is continued coordination with the city and our other agency partners. The city of Kent has been a great partner so far. We have been talking about the different types of capital investments that could really make this project work as well as it can, and we continue to do that through this design phase. In addition, we'll be engaging with the local community and making sure that we're continuing to meet those goals that we've heard of improving access and making sure that we could design the project that meets those goals. And one more slide. Some very specific next steps. We are asking the King County Council to adopt that alignment and stations and then move into final design. As I mentioned, we just talked to them earlier today, so we're well on our way through that next step. And then continued coordination with the city and the community to make sure that as we move through design, those priorities continue to rise to the top to make sure that we have the project that best meets our needs. And our last next step there is one small aspects of this project that's really driving our schedule. And I know I've mentioned this at previous updates. We have a submittal with the FTA this summer for a competitive grant that we are partnering across all of our agencies to make sure that we have a very competitive application for that competitive grant process. We have a big milestone this summer to submit some of those materials. That alignment ordinance for the routes and the stations that the city provided a letter of support in was a key milestone in achieving that. So I really appreciate all of the work from the city, from the technical staff, as well as all of you today in helping us achieve that goal. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Greg. Any questions for Greg or Lauren? Councilmember Boyce.
Hey, Greg, I think the biggest thing for us, and we talked about this when you came last time and presented to us, the safety piece, right? So you talk about the extra lighting, which is good, What about security? I mean, is that lighting, extra lighting is going to solve the problem, or do you think there need to be extra security around some of these here stations where people catch the buses?
Yeah, that is quite an ongoing question, and we are continuing to look into other measures other than just lighting. We do hear that lighting is something that a lot of people ask for, and a lighting is something that helps people do feel more confident to be waiting for the bus. That's not the end-all be-all answer. We do know that with higher frequency and more information, it's a lot easier for people to feel a little more secure, that they can show up and go and know that the bus is coming in a few minutes and have that security of knowing that the bus is coming. But you are absolutely correct. It is an ongoing question that our team is continuing to look at, not only in our design process of making sure that the station area doesn't have any other extra risk factors involved in the design process, but then also how we operate this, not just on RapidRide, but throughout our system.
And thank you. And who's responsible for the cleanliness of these areas? That's the city or that's the county to make sure these places stay clean, garbage dump? Because I ride around, you can see some of the places where garbage look pretty bad all over the place. So who's responsible for the cleanliness?
I am not completely confident in answering that myself. I know that we do have crews that do maintain our facilities, but I do know we do have partnerships with our cities to make sure that we are addressing any of these concerns. I know that the assets that Metro owns, we do maintain, but it's definitely a partnership that we need to be continually working with our city partners on, what those issues are and making sure that we're addressing them. So that's definitely something that I know our team is well aware of and something we want to continue to work on.
I guess April. I mean, do you know? I mean, you do ride around. Some of the places look pretty bad. So that's agreement we work out with the county for making sure these places get clean on a regular basis, or how did that process work?
I'm not sure exactly what that process looks like, but it is something that I can definitely find out and elevate. Lauren Craig would probably be, who's on the line, would probably be the person I would need to talk to in order to find out that answer. So I can get back to you.
I think the Madam Mayor would agree with me on this here. I think, cleanliness is key, right? So we just need to know the role and responsibility for who is responsible for cleaning it and how frequently that place get cleaned up as well, too, as we go forward. So thank you.
That's definitely understandable. This is Lauren Craig. Thank you for your question. It's a question that comes up with many jurisdictions. I think that, Greg, you are absolutely right, is that we do have a Metro cleaning crew that does maintain our facilities, particularly if there's an issue. We do maintain them on a regular basis as well. The City of Kent will maintain the City of Kent streets and facilities. But again, going back to what Greg said, is that's something that, we will discuss during sort of with the City of Kent on an ongoing basis to ensure that we partner and provide feedback to one another to ensure that the stations are clean.
Thank you. Madam Mayor, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Council President. Councilmember Boyce, to your point, we absolutely have continued to elevate, especially the RapidRide line station that's currently on Pack Highway, with our concerns about making sure that it's maintained and clean around that stop. So you have my commitment to make sure we keep that conversation going, because it is frustrating when you drive by there. The appearance, and I know that it's also frustrating to existing businesses, and we certainly don't want to recreate that problem with the new RapidRide line. So it definitely something we'll continue to work with King County Metro on.
Thank you,
This is Lauren Craig. Thank you, Mayor Ralph. If there, I believe that you'll likely be addressing that with the appropriate channels. If that ever becomes a block, please feel free to reach out to Greg or myself, and we can identify the appropriate person to work with.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Greg, you talked about the Small Starts grant application coming up in August. Do you expect any issues with that? If you were not to get that grant, would that delay any of this process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. We are hopeful that we will be able to get our full grant ask when we submit this summer, but we do realize that it is a competitive process. So a lot of what we did in our planning phase and coming to our conceptual design that we just finalized was saying what the project could look like for that grant. We do understand that there could be a world where we don't get that grant or the federal dollars change as a result of shifting budget priorities. And so our team has been looking at what some of those what if scenarios look like and making sure that if we do have to look at either other grant programs or looking at a locally funded source or potentially altering the schedule in order to try to go after that grant the next year. Those sort of scenarios are things that we're definitely working on in the background. Obviously not ideal, but definitely something we're keeping abreast.
Great, thank you. When can we expect to have another update on this?
I will leave that up to April. I will gladly come talk to you anytime you like.
So the plan is right now we're moving towards 30% design, where we get a lot more kind of definitive understanding of where the project affects along the corridor and the roadways it's going to traverse. So as we get more information on that, I anticipate coming back to you late summer, early fall. Some of it is just dependent on how fast that progress happens.
Thank you. Any other questions for this team on this topic in particular? All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, Greg, and Lauren from King County Metro for joining us. We are going to move on to the last item on our agenda, which is the House Bill 1754. And I'd like to welcome first. He's going to kind of do an introduction.
Okay, thank you, Council. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Pat Fitzpatrick, City Attorney. I'm going to provide you with a brief introduction of this matter, and then I'll hand it over to Haley, and she's going to talk about the draft ordinance that's in your packet there. If you recall, at the April 14th Committee of the Whole meeting, Haley briefed you on House Bill 1754. And at the conclusion of that briefing, you directed staff to work on an ordinance. And so over the past couple of weeks, we've been working hard. Haley and Adam Long in my office have been driving this with the assistance of myself and Aaron George and ECD. So we've got an ordinance for you to look at, but I want to reacquaint you with House Bill 1754 and just bring you up to speed with where we are today and where we're headed. So back to the start with House Bill 1754. It was passed during the last legislative session, and on March 31st, it was signed into law by the governor. It becomes effective on June 11th, and the critical issue with this House bill is that it really limits the city's ability to regulate housing for the homeless on church property. However, the bill allows for regulations that exist prior to the bill's effective date to remain enforceable and applicable. And so this is basically a grandfathering clause. And it wasn't in the original bill proposed, but it was negotiated into the bill that was eventually passed. And there's good reason for that. I think I've said this before to you in other circumstances, but with very few limitations, Washington law recognizes that a city is in a much better position to determine appropriate land uses in the city as opposed to the state. And so almost uniformly, zoning control is given to cities. There are some exceptions for things like essential facilities like a sewage treatment plant or something that's of a regional scale. But almost uniformly, zoning is left to cities. And this bill, for the most part, tends to take away a lot of zoning authority from the city. However, it did, fortunately, the legislature recognized the importance of city zoning authority and included this grandfather clause. And so that's why we're here today, because we have to get something on the books to ensure that we have the ability to regulate not only now, but in the future. So we have an ordinance for you tonight that's just for introduction. And the public hearing is going to be scheduled for May 5th at the next council meeting. And in order to meet that deadline that we have to meet, that June 11th deadline, it's critical that that ordinance be passed on May 5th. And so tonight we're hoping that after or while you hear Haley's presentation of what we've come up with, that you will have your comments and we can make any adjustments that we need to make before the May 5th hearing date. And then there's two things I want to address, two things that were brought up at the last council meeting. The first one was that one of the council members mentioned that, you know, this is an important issue and it seems to be being fast tracked, and we would definitely agree with you. Staff has been pounding away on this in such short order, but that's because of the time limit we were put under. We basically had from March 31st until now to come up with something that we believe that you will be comfortable with. The main point though is that once you pass this ordinance, there will be opportunities to amend it down the road if that's needed. If you don't pass an ordinance, those opportunities to amend are forfeited. So it's really important. I just want to remind you how important it is to get something on the books right now. Second is, and I'm not sure if this came up at the last meeting, but it certainly came up with staff, and that is that there was a desire, we spoke with Human Services, and there was a clear desire that we don't want to upset what is currently occurring at churches. There are a couple of programs, the Kent Hope program and the Home and W Home program that provide shelter, indoor shelter for the homeless, rotating through various churches here in Kent. And so staff, we've come up with an exception that would basically carve out those programs so that they could remain active as they are currently being operated, unhindered by this ordinance. So, and then the other thing is that it would completely exempt inclement weather shelters. They would not be subject to this ordinance at all. So I just wanted to give you that brief opening of what we're dealing with here. If you have any questions for me, that's fine. I can answer them. Otherwise, I just would like to hand it over to Haley and she'll dig into the details of what you have before you.
All right, let's go ahead, Haley.
Okay, thank you all. This is Haley Bonsteel, Long Range Planning Manager. So I'm going to walk you through the ordinance that we have. And first, I just want to give you a sense for the overall kind of intent of the changes in some of the details beyond what Pat was just describing. So what we have in front of you is a sort of moderate geographic expansion. So we did expand geographically where churches are permitted to host the homeless. The big change is allowing outdoor facilities of some type. So that was really the focus of House Bill 1754, was those various kinds of outdoor facilities. And then we also needed to address some sort of basic health and safety parameters, and we got those from King County Public Health primarily. We also utilized fire code and building code for some of the safety and sort of site planning, you know, making sure that folks would be able to get to emergency exits and that kind of thing. And then there were also administrative requirements that we took a look at, and we used an example from the city of Bellevue for inspiration there. So with those kind of in mind, let's start on the details. So one of the first important things that we changed here, and it might be a little bit unintuitive to how we use the language today, is differentiating between indoor and outdoor facilities. So previously we had one combined definition for housing or shelter, and we're calling indoor facilities housing and outdoor facilities shelter. And if that's confusing, that it's understandable, because I think we currently call the existing operations that are inside churches shelters. So this may be one of those things where if we come back with amendments, we may take a look at really there's such a huge variety of types of facilities. We may need to dial in definitions further, but for now we needed to make sure that we're addressing both indoor and outdoor. And so that's how we chose to differentiate those. So the main bulk of the work was really expanding into multifamily zones, the hosting of the homeless, by religious organizations, and the expansion from indoor to outdoor. So that primarily takes place in footnote 31. And that footnote has been added to the multifamily zones, sort of low, medium, and high, as we would call them, garden, medium, and high. Those are the three zones where we are expanding this allowance. And so I'm going to walk you through what's in footnote 31. And then we also have another footnote that deals with commercial and industrial zones. So footnote 31 begins with kind of general conditions that apply to both indoor and outdoor. And so this would be those, most of these come from Bellevue. So this is sort of the administrative side. This is, there's 1,000-foot buffer between facilities. There's, different level, one maximum amount of time of operation, which is 90 days. That's actually from our own code. We had previously had something on the books that said that individuals couldn't stay for more than 90 days. And we thought that it made more sense to regulate the facilities because we're really not regulating individuals. It must be the same size as the church or at a maximum. The church is ultimately responsible for the facility. No drugs, there's emergency provisions, making sure everything meets fire code, and then really that documentation stuff that from Bellevue regarding staffing operations, managing the exterior appearance, who's the point of contact, making sure that we have that information, conflict resolution, site plan, that kind of thing. So that applies to indoor and outdoor facilities in all those multifamily zones. Which comes to 4 total zones, I think, at this point, because they were already allowed in MRD. So now they're also allowed in MRG, MRM, and MRH. So then the next piece of footnote 31 just talks about those indoor facilities briefly, just requiring that they be a minimum of 1 acre size. And most of the new regulations are about the outdoor. So that's the last piece of footnote 31. So for those outdoor facilities, and this we got mostly from the King County Public Health requirements for encampments. But one thing that we added to that that is not required there is for all of the, essentially if you have small tents, that they be inside of a larger kind of tensile membrane structure or tent. And we chose a minimum size tent based on fire safety. So we had a lot of conversations with John Napier, and we also talked with Steve Wilson, our building official, just to make sure that we were optimizing for people's safety. We didn't want, kind of hastily put up facilities that ultimately actually endanger people more than they help anyone. So the fire code and building code are the basis for a lot of what you see towards the end of footnote 31 there. 50 square foot minimum per person. Again, that's from building code. And then the basic sanitation requirements, that's all again from King County Public Health. So, making sure that folks have access to cleaning supplies, that there's, litter pickup and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of takes you through the bulk of the new conditions. So there's those general conditions at the beginning, and then a lot more specifics for the outdoor facilities. So the last kind of big piece here is that we also added those general conditions to the commercial industrial zones. Now today, today existing on the books, emergency shelters, which it's unclear in our code if outdoor would be allowed, are permitted in commercial and industrial zones without any conditions. It's a conditional use permit, but there's no footnote with specific requirements. And conditional use permits allow us a little bit of flexibility, but really not a ton. So what we have now is to actually put some conditions on those to say indoor facilities only, and then to do those same general conditions as I described previously for, 1,000-foot buffer, no drugs, some of those emergency provisions, and then really just that documentation to make sure that, we have on the books sort of how these things are going to function so that we're aware and we can coordinate services to the extent that we need to. So that's the other sort of big change. That language is mostly repeated, so it shouldn't be new language that you're looking at for the most part in footnote 35, but we are trying to apply that to commercial zones where at the moment we don't have any of those requirements. And that said, I did hear from our current planning manager, Aaron George, that In 15 years, we've never had any applicants come in that she's ever been aware of for those in those commercial and industrial zones for a conditional use permit. So we're not nervous about these requirements, stymieing any services that might have popped up. I think people will want to meet these if they have this plan to do it anyway, and so far no one has had these plans. So the last big piece, and this is something that Pat mentioned, but I just want to make sure that everyone got their eyes on it, is the provision to ensure that we're preserving existing known providers. So like Pat mentioned, we worked with Marina Hansen and Human Services to make sure that those existing overnight shelters and programs sponsored by churches, Catholic Community Services, Kent Hope, all of those, that those are able to continue existing without any need to meet new regulations. Just based on that, they seem to be providing a great service at the moment, and we didn't want to mess with that. So if they at any point try to change their methods, they may come under some of these new regulations. But I think we would also utilize existing contracts or MOUs to make sure that just if the city has a role to play, that we have a way to play that role. But other than that, I think that these existing facilities will be unaffected. So that was a major goal that we were able to accommodate here. So I think that takes you through the basis of the ordinance. I know we have a few different folks on the line who are available to help with questions if you have them, because this has been a very interdisciplinary effort. So with that, I think I'm happy to take those questions and ask my colleagues to help as well.
All right, thank you, Haley, so much. And thank you to everyone that has put this together so quickly so that we can move forward in the time frame we need to. I am going to call on Councilmember Fincher first.
Oh, thank you, Madam President. Haley, I was wondering, so there are places in there where it's specific, like you can't have more, or you have to have one toilet for every X number of people with a hand washing station, or you can only have X number of people in this type of shelter. So one of the things that I was questioning is for the, I think it was the emergency, under the emergency section for emergency housing, they needed to have 2 first aid kits and 2 naloxone kits. But if you have 15 people, that's a lot different than having 35 people. So I was wondering why there you didn't go by the size of it and what constitutes a large kit. It just said, you have to have 2 large first aid kits. How are
Good. So this is only for those outdoor facilities, and this is these numbers came from King County Public Health, and they do not have a maximum as we do of 35 people. So we have a maximum on these outdoor shelters of 35 folks being served at one time. And so, I think the 2 large first aid kits may have served more people than 35 in the King County place. So it seemed like likely sufficient. And, 1 portable toilet per 20 people. Again, that's for those outdoor encampments. If you had 15 people, you would, depending on how you round, I guess, you would need, there could only be up to 2. So essentially, we're trying to keep these to a manageable size, and because of that, we felt that the numbers that King County put out there were reasonable. And in terms of what large first aid kit means, that's a great question. I don't know the details of what would count as large or small. I think that folks who operate these already are likely to be the ones who are interested in operating more of them, and they already have to meet these requirements for King County. So it kind of makes sense to stay with the way King County does it, because they likely have, first aid kits approved. But I can find out more if you would like us to dial in that kind of regulation.
Oh, I just wanted to be clear so that the groups know what they're expected to have, and that we have an answer if it was to come back to us. And then I guess it's because of what the county recommended also, but the naloxone seems like that would also be good for maybe the transitional housing, to require it in more places than we actually did.
Yeah, we could expand that to being required in the indoor as well, if you'd like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Councilmember Larmer.
Thank you, Council President. And Haley, thank you for this putting this together and for answering my questions earlier in email. I did have a couple. I just want to make sure, I guess I'm understanding the location specifics. We're saying that you can have, in multifamily zones, you can have indoor or outdoor emergency shelters. And in commercial, you can only have indoor shelters.
Yeah, commercial and industrial. Yep.
Industrial, okay. Why would we not, I guess, why would we permit outdoor in multifamily but not in the commercial industrial?
Yeah, good question. You know, we really struggled with how to expand things in a moderate way that wouldn't require, for instance, levels of analysis that we don't have time to do, but still meaningfully expand where these kind of services can be provided in a way that generally meets what we think the intent of that 1754 grandfathering is. So because we already allowed indoor in commercial and industrial zones, we didn't really want to vastly change what was happening in those zones. We wanted to kind of, you know, maybe make the criteria consistent, but not, you know, I mean, just as an example, the Industrial Valley is a really large portion of the city, and to allow a new type of facility there felt like a bigger reach than in sort of more targeted multifamily zones, and particularly because multifamily zones are designed for, you know, dense living, right? It's for people to live close together. And so it felt to us like expanding into multifamily zones was something that, you know, the comprehensive plan has considered people living in multifamily zones already. And so we wouldn't need to do a whole lot of new analysis about, you know, what would it mean to have folks outside or intense, you know, living sort of right, you know, close to each other in an area that hasn't seen that before. Does that kind of help paint that picture?
Yeah, that does, and that actually makes a lot of sense.
It wasn't like an easy, you know, clear thing. So I understand why it's we were kind of threading some needles between what was expansion and what was you know, sort of conservative.
And then the other thing I noticed is in just the list from King County on the conditions of operating and what was there's a prohibition on drugs, but I didn't see one about weapons. Is is it not?
You know, that's a great question. I will look and see if because the King County checklist is like dozens of pages long. So we didn't take every single requirement, but I'm curious now that you mentioned that, it's a really good point, is do they have that on their checklist? And if not, it may still be something that we want to consider including. So I will look into that, and we'll figure out if there's a way to work that in, or if I guess we'll figure out if there's any reason not to work that in, because it sounds logical to me.
Great, thank you.
All right, is that good, Councilmember Larmer?
Yes, thank you.
All right, let's move on to Councilmember Michaud.
Thank you, Council President. Haley, I just want to make sure that I am understanding this right. The only zones impacted by this are multifamily and commercial. Is that correct?
So multifamily zones are newly allowing facilities, yes. Commercial and industrial, what is allowed to happen is not changing, but the criteria that they must meet to allow it to happen is changing. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
All right, any other questions? Councilmember Larmer. Oh, your hand is down. Any questions from any other council members or any comments? And then just a reminder, Haley, I think Pat mentioned that I know that, you know, this ordinance needs to be done within a period of time and very quickly, but once it is done, throughout this process, if there's anything that was to come up, we could make amendments to it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so moving forward, I know Councilmember Fincher had I wanted maybe some clarification on a few things, and then maybe looking into the prohibiting weapons piece. Does that give you some direction?
Yes, I think those two pieces are should be very easy to accommodate.
Okay, Pat, did you have another comment or?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was just going to hit on what you were just asking. And I think what I'm hearing is that we will prepare some subtle changes to the ordinance to address the naloxone issue and a prohibition on weapons issue. I didn't hear any objection to that from the other council members. So I think Haley and my group will work on that, and we'll bring that back to you on May 5th.
Wonderful. Did anyone have any other comments or concerns to mention at this point?
I do not.
All right, wonderful. Well, I appreciate this conversation and everyone working together so we can get this moved forward quickly with that hearing coming on May 5th. And Haley, there's nothing else you need from us at this point then?
No, thank you so much.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Well, that brings us to the end of our agenda. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Stay safe, and we are adjourned.
The piece of paper, drop it into our jar, and it's going to have that heat and steam and everything that wants to escape rise, and it's going to suck this out of the way into the jar so it can all escape. Sounds pretty cool. Now, we gotta see if it works. First thing you do, get rid of the egg, move it to the side. Then, you're gonna take your little cup of water, get a little bit of water. You're gonna rub it around